Heading into training camp, the Denver Broncos cornerback room is the deepest position on the team, and there's some exciting training camp position battles at this position that we'll break down and much more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you know it's your team every day as we continue our training camp position previews here to set the stage for this upcoming season. A special shout out to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for tuning in and making us your first listen, however you choose to do so. Make sure if you're not yet an everydayer, become one. Hit that subscribe or that follow button wherever you get your podcasts or YouTube so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports.
And I'm Sayre Bedinger, site expert at predominantlyorange.com.
And here's what you could expect on today's episode of the show as we continue our training camp position previews. Yes, this is the fun time where we take a look at every position group, and we'll also break down every position battle, the biggest question there at that position, as well as the team prepares for the start of training camp later on this month. We're focusing on cornerback and why the Broncos cornerback group right now is the deepest position on this football team going into training camp. We'll talk about which players we anticipate will play the most snaps at corner, what matchups might be contingent upon who gets used the most, and we'll go through why Jahdae Barron and Ja'Quan McMillian are two names to watch for some of the more important position battles that will take place here in the month of July leading through August to set the table for the 2025 NFL season. Sayre, let's go through our overview here to start. Obviously, the Broncos cornerback room returning the reigning, defending, undisputed Defensive Player of the Year, Pat Surtain, to the room. And obviously, you're one of the best players in all of the National Football League right now. And this room right now, considering where it was at last season when they lost Riley Moss, you look at this Broncos cornerback room right now on paper, it's arguably the deepest that they've had in a handful of years.
It is, and it's one of the most exciting position groups on the team with that combination of you got the Defensive Player of the Year out there, but you've also got all these guys that are young. They're on rookie contracts, right? And that's what's so exciting is that there's so much talent, and yet the Broncos, they're not really paying the price for it, other than Pat Surtain, who's getting paid more, I guess, what he deserves and then some, right? I mean, he's one of the highest paid defensive backs in league history at this point. But certainly you feel like the Broncos are getting a pretty good bang for their buck, even though Pat Surtain is on that big money deal. They've scouted well. They continue to take shots in the NFL draft year over year. That's one of George Paton's things. You can go back and look at some of his later classes with the Minnesota Vikings as well, just constantly using high draft capital on defensive backs. The reason for that is we know you pass the ball a ton in today's NFL. You got to have guys back there in coverage that can make plays, and you certainly feel like the Broncos have a plethora of players that can do that, and it's fun to see sort of every area of the draft and after being touched, right? You got your first rounder, Pat Surtain, got your day 2 steal, Riley Moss, got the undrafted guy, Ja'Quan McMillian, another first rounder in Jahdae Barron coming in, day 3's draft steal, Kris Abrams-Draine. There's guys all over the depth chart here. And now you've got a UFL guy coming in, right, Cody? So it's just kind of every stone is getting turned over to make this one of the deepest cornerback rooms in the league today, if not the deepest.
And you're always going to have a lot of players at this position and safety at training camp because there's a handful of wide receivers, a handful of tight ends and skill players that all these guys are going to have to cover here as the team looks to try to formulate their best 53-man roster. And certainly over the last handful of years, we've seen Denver alternate between keeping 5 cornerbacks, 6 safeties, 6 corners, 5 safeties. Who knows what it's going to be this year? And so much of that is going to be contingent upon special teams impact. But I think it's safe to say right now, with this deepest cornerback room that this team has had in quite some time, I think there are a handful of guys who are solidified locks. I think that there are 4 guys who are evident roster locks right now. Obviously, Pat Surtain, Riley Moss, Ja'Quan McMillian, and Jahdae Barron, the first-round draft pick that the Broncos got this year, that they felt like corner is an elite premium position. It is a position of need no matter how many guys you have at the NFL, because if you lose one guy due to an injury, there is a massive drop-off often at times for most NFL teams. And the Broncos, they experienced that firsthand. They had a veteran option that it felt like, hey, if something happens, we got a veteran guy who's got a lot of experience in Levi Wallace that maybe this guy can step up. No, that was not the case here for the Broncos, which I think goes to show how much scheme fit matters over veteran status any day. At least Fabian Moreau was more productive when he was on the Broncos defense at cornerback as a veteran option a couple of years ago. But when Riley Moss went down with that injury, Denver's defense, they struggled, right? And teams, they didn't throw to Pat Surtain's way, but they went Levi Wallace's way, to the point the Broncos had to invest in saying, hey, we got to go to our rookie, Kris Abrams-Draine, who maybe we should have gone to him a little bit sooner in this approach. The addition of Jahdae Barron makes this Broncos cornerback room deeper, but also I think gives them some security, some insurance in the event there is an injury to one of these players and one of the key guys there, whether it be Ja'Quan McMillian, Riley Moss, or Pat Surtain.
Yeah, they have the ability to weather the storm over an 18-game season. I know we bring this quote up all the time, but Vic Fangio once famously said there's basically 96 starting corners in the NFL, and there ain't 96 starting corners in the NFL, right? Because you ultimately spend most of your time playing in the nickel alignment, which means every team has 3 starting corners. And because of that, you've got to have way more depth than you realize. That's why people always say, well, you can never have too many good corners. That's so true in today's NFL. And the Broncos are a prime example of that last year when they had Levi Wallace come into that Cleveland game and nearly, that could have cost them the playoffs ultimately, Cody, if they had lost that game. A huge matchup for them in terms of their AFC standing. So it looms large over the course of the year to have that depth. But more so than just depth, it feels like the Broncos have like quality talent across the board. I think maybe 6 or 7 guys who could legitimately play in the NFL, and then a couple of wild cards who developed all last year on the practice squad, right? Quentin Newsome, Reese Taylor. They brought in a couple of undrafted guys this year as well to try and develop them. But nobody really even talks about Damari Mathis at this point, who could probably play for a number of teams. I know in our last episode that we did earlier this offseason about Damari, seemed like a lot of fans are saying, oh, Damari Mathis stinks. Guy can't play. Nobody would want to trade for him, things like that. I think Damari is even kind of underrated in that way, that he could play if needed. And he could probably play pretty well if the Broncos were leaning on him as one of their top 4 guys this year. So it's a very good group. It's athletic. They've got ball skills. They're physical. They understand what they're being asked to do. They communicate well. And they've got some of the best coaches in the league, Cody. Jim Leonard, obviously, pass game specialist, a defensive backs coach. Vance Joseph is a DBs guy, and then other assistants as well. They're getting set up in really great positions to succeed.
That's why I love their depth there. And look, I agree with you on Damari Mathis. Damari is very underrated. So many people have already written Damari Mathis off. And look, he's playing in the last year of his rookie deal. There's a massive chip on Damari's shoulder. And I think a lot of the hate that Damari has gotten about his play, I think a lot of it's unwarranted. I mean, he stepped up in a big way as a rookie. You know, there was some concern about pass interference calls. He was seeing a lot of targets opposite of guess who? Pat Surtain. And it wasn't bad penalties. It was subject, ticky-tack, like, that's 50-50, could be called early, could be called, it shouldn't be called. There's the fine line between some of those plays there. And then year number 2, the biggest issue for Damari was injuries. He dealt with some injuries at that point. You factor in, obviously, the early season struggles that the Broncos had in 2023, where they made widespread personnel changes to their defensive scheme. And then you saw some of that kind of trickle down a little bit, where Damari was a little bit in the doghouse and he had to embrace the role on special teams in order to get off. And then really last year, it's just the emergence of Riley Moss that really kind of put Damari on the back burner in that cornerback competition. But Damari, I felt like, stepped up in a big way for Denver late down the stretch last season. You go to that Cleveland game, Damari started playing a little bit more on the dime inside the slot, not playing on the outside. And this is a guy who's just trying to get an opportunity to get on the field. Has never had a bad attitude about what is happening anytime he's gotten benched. I think Damari is a guy that people shouldn't write off necessarily just yet. And he's going to obviously be one of the players we highlight in some of our position battles to watch for here as the Broncos begin training camp a little bit later on this month. But Broncos Country coming up next, we'll tell you why Jahdae Barron versus Ja'Quan McMillian will be the show to watch when you talk about competition at the cornerback position. You're going to get that much more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by friends over there at the Gametime app. And we've all been there logging on early and waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show that you've been dying to see. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping. And that's where Gametime comes in, because Gametime, they make getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever, because prices actually drop as it gets closer to showtime. And you can save up to 60% off with their killer last-minute deals.
When you're making an investment to go make memories at a concert or sporting event in the summer, one of the last things you want to do is be unpleasantly surprised by your seat where you're going to watch this event. So if you wonder what your seat is going to look like before you buy your tickets, the Gametime app shows you a panoramic seat view, so there are no surprises. Take the guesswork out of buying concert and show tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Having depth is a great problem to have in the NFL, but it also begs the question, who's going to be playing the majority of snaps out there? And especially when you talk about cornerback for the Denver Broncos, it's an interesting question, because probably 5, if not more, starting caliber players out there. That's what we're going to discuss on today's training camp preview for the cornerback position here at Locked On Broncos. And Cody, I'm excited because you feel like this is the biggest strength on the team. You feel like maybe the Broncos could even trade from some of this depth, which I know we'll talk about down the line here. But I think the biggest question at cornerback going into training camp for the Denver Broncos is who's actually going to play. And we know Pat Surtain's going to play. We know Riley Moss is going to play. I know there's some listeners that would disagree with that, and so maybe we can talk about that as well. But I think that those two guys are for sure going to play. What do you see being the snap dividing between a player like Ja'Quan McMillian, who's been starting for 2 years, and then Jahdae Barron, who's obviously got that first-round draft pick label?
Yeah, it's tough to gauge because, I mean, Ja'Quan McMillian is a very impressive under-the-radar nickel defender that I thought stepped up, emerged onto the scene for the Broncos in 2023. 2024, I think he still played at a high level. There were some times where he gave up some catches on the inside there. Seemed like there were some miscommunications on the Broncos defensively, but certainly I think it warranted the Broncos saying, hey, like, now we're going to bring in a guy in Jahdae Barron who's an elite level premium player at a premium position that we view as valuable in today's NFL, with all the wide receivers that you have to face, all the quarterbacks, and how much this game has evolved really into a passing league. You have to have that level of diversity, and you have a guy who can maybe play outside and inside. But the vision here for Jahdae Barron is going to be inside the nickel primarily. And that's not really in question right now. He can play outside, but the vision for him is playing inside the nickel. That's where the Broncos liked a lot of what they saw. And granted, he can do some of the other things they need on the outside. But I really think that this is going to be the premier position battle to watch here for the Broncos. And regardless of who wins there, the other player is going to be on this roster, right? So if Ja'Quan McMillian wins the competition during training camp in the preseason, Jahdae Barron's still going to play plenty of defensive snaps this upcoming season. I think the Broncos have flexibility in how they can call the defense, who they can match guys up on. And if Jahdae Barron wins the job, Ja'Quan McMillian is still going to be playing quite a bit of football here for this Denver Broncos defense. So I think it's a luxury right now. You just want to see who's going to get the job here. I think just naturally being a first-round pick, Jahdae Barron, you're always going to have pressure as the first-round pick, because people are like, well, if he doesn't play, then he's a bust. I think that's a stupid narrative, and I think people have to stop thinking like that, because I've already seen that. People were even going back in the offseason programs here, and they're saying, hey, no one's talking about Jahdae Barron. That must mean that he's a bust. No, you don't have to talk about the guy in order for him to be a good player or for him to be looking good. That's fine. Like, with this Broncos cornerback room, the fact that we're not talking about him as much in the offseason program, that's good news. Let him continue to learn the playbook and grow. He's doing great. He's going to do great here in training camp. And I think that that's going to be the most exciting thing here. But in terms of overall number of snaps played at corner, Sayre, I think it's a safe assumption right now to say that PS2, Riley Moss, those guys will probably have the higher volume of overall snaps. And then I think really whoever wins that nickel job for the Broncos, they're going to play, I think, an equal amount of snaps as to those guys, depending on how often the Broncos are a nickel, because at one point, really last year, that was their base, was the base nickel versus just your standard base defense where you have two corners and you have 2 safeties. It's different. Base nickel means, hey, we got an extra defensive back in here. We're going with 5 guys versus 4. I don't have a definitive answer for you, but that's how I think it will go.
If the Broncos secondary is like a hand of cards in the game Uno, I think Jahdae Barron could be sort of like that wild card that, you say, okay, who's going to play the most snaps at corner this year? And I think maybe you can shift it a little bit to say, well, what if I got this wild card right here in Jahdae Barron? What if he ends up having to play a little safety? Because we know he played some safety at the college level. We know the Broncos, again, the war on attrition affects every position group. Jahdae's good at that. And I know that the Broncos aren't necessarily going to transition him to safety, but what if injuries necessitate that over the course of a season to say, we need our best 5 guys out there at all times. And ultimately Jahdae is one of the best 5, but somebody else goes down with an injury. And then you have to kind of reshuffle things. I think he could be that wild card that Vance Joseph could say, all right, we're going to, if Hufanga goes down for a game or 2, Jahdae Barron's going to play that position and Ja'Quan's going to step into the slot, and they can feel good about those sorts of things. Riley Moss goes down for a game, or Pat Surtain goes down for a game. You feel comfortable about putting Jahdae on the outside, right? So I think he's one of those guys that you can pencil in for anywhere. Not that he's only going to be an injury replacement, but he is somebody that I do feel like the Broncos could move around as a wild card option to get the best 5 out on the field all times.
I would say as well, in the offseason program, the Broncos also believe that Ja'Quan could play outside. There's been times in the offseason program, it was during OTAs when Pat wasn't there for that one OTA practice that we had, where they had J-Mac on the outside, Jahdae inside the nickel, and Riley on the other outside position. So we know that J-Mac can also play on the outside there. For me as well, like we could even see a transition. Just depends on who you play, where the Broncos might just stay in dime quite a bit, right? Or they go that big dime where, you have a guy like J.L. Skinner or Talanoa Hufanga can drop down and play. And maybe you rotate another guy back at the safety position. I mean, the Broncos have flexibility here, but let's get into maybe some of the bigger position battles to watch here as it pertains to like a Ja'Quan McMillian versus Jahdae Barron. What are the strengths of these guys here? I look at J-Mac. This is a guy who I think is very good in pass coverage inside the slot, which is a tough job to do. But the one thing I think that Ja'Quan does really well as well, Sayre, he comes up and run support. He's a really good tackler. He takes good angles. He never gets beat in terms of letting guys outside of him in the run game. This is where I think he has an advantage. But you look at Jahdae's college tape, he's also good against the run. Like the Broncos have 2 guys that can play in the slot that are good against the pass, good against the run, and that is hard to find in today's game.
It is. I mean, when you talk about Ja'Quan McMillian, he's had 3 sacks over the last 2 years, 11 tackles for loss, 5 quarterback hits, and then 139 career tackles, including 81 last season. So he is physical. He does come up and run support. He can make plays behind the line of scrimmage. And matter of fact, Cody, he's made some really big plays. Like he's had 3 forced fumbles over the last 2 seasons as well. So I think his production obviously works in his favor. He definitely shouldn't be getting written off. This is why I think this is maybe the most interesting discussion of the offseason, because it's getting underrated because nobody's really considering the idea that, well, the Broncos have 4 corners that should be playing and starting and playing starter snaps, and yet typically you only see 3 guys get that share in a defensive scheme. So how they utilize these guys is going to be really interesting to see come time for the regular season. I think we'll see these guys on the field quite a bit, but I mean, obviously somebody's going to be playing a smaller percentage than the public is expecting at this point. And I think ultimately that will be Ja'Quan McMillian, although I don't know. I mean, maybe not. Maybe Jahdae Barron and he's going to be brought along slower as a rookie, and the Broncos are going to let him kind of play a more versatile role. I don't know. We'll see what happens, but I think it's really a fascinating discussion because of McMillian's productivity.
Broncos Country, make sure you share your thoughts on us on J-Mac versus Jahdae Barron for the starting nickel job here for the Broncos this upcoming season. Your thoughts on how that may go here. Let's get to another one as well. I think really we talked about there being 4 solidified cornerback spots here with Barron, PS2, Riley Moss, and J-Mac here. But what does that 5th one look like? Right now, you got a few guys competing. Damari Mathis, we talked about earlier. I think we'll see Damari Mathis versus Kris Abrams-Draine versus Mario Goodrich. And it's kind of tough for a guy like Quentin Newsome right now, because Quentin Newsome may very well be a practice squad guy. Once again, the Broncos really liked how he helped them last year. How do you see this one going? Because right now I look at it as though Damari's got this chip on his shoulder. He's the underdog here. I think the advantage right now on paper kind of lends itself to Kris Abrams-Draine, who shined in the small sample size we saw from him last season, even though that the Broncos, they believed, and they obviously said it, they acknowledged it publicly, that out of all the rookies last season, he had the slowest start to coming along. But man, when he got on the field, he was impressive last year.
He really was. And I think that's his biggest advantage right now, along with the fact that he still has 3 years left on his rookie deal, as opposed to Damari Mathis, who's entering the final year of his contract. And Broncos are looking at paying quite a bit for him to either ride the pine or play only special teams. So certainly that's going to be a factor in this discussion. And of course, we've talked about this before. You want to do right by a player like that, right? Who's getting ready for free agency next year. You don't want him just sitting and rotting on your bench, even especially when it comes to this discussion of, even in the event of injury, he may not go out there and play because we have other guys ahead of him on the depth chart. That's where I think you get into that discussion about this guy could really be traded. And so I do think some teams would have interest in that. I mean, certainly, Cody, not every team has corners as talented as Damari Mathis. I think the Broncos are spoiled in that way.
Yeah, and I think maybe some teams to keep an eye on, teams of familiarity. The New York Jets with Darren Muji now over there, obviously had a big part in the draft process for Damari coming in. I think the Philadelphia Eagles with Christian Parker being the passing game coordinator over there for Vic Fangio could be an option over there for Vic's defense. And then I'll even go to the lengths of saying, okay, hey, keep an eye on the 3 teams that the Broncos will play in the preseason: the San Francisco 49ers, the Arizona Cardinals, and the New Orleans Saints there. That's all, I think, things that we have to keep our eye on here as potential trade destinations, which, I mean, if the Broncos view like, hey, we've invested draft capital, we like where Abrams-Draine is at, but we're in a position right now where we just can't justify paying a guy like Damari Mathis the money it takes for him to be a rotational player. It makes the most sense for the Broncos to maybe receive back-end capital, whether it be a 7th or a 6th-round pick, potentially there. That's something that we could see here for the Broncos. But Broncos Country, our show is going to continue here as we continue to dive deeper at the cornerback position, and we'll dive into how the Broncos and Vance Joseph may plan to deploy the cornerback unit this upcoming season, what those established roles may be early on. We'll break that down much more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. How Vance Joseph and the Broncos defense plan to deploy their cornerbacks this upcoming season will be a strategic move that could help the Broncos win even more games this upcoming season. Could be an advantage for them to evolve and ascend as to one of the league's top defenses in 2025. We'll tell you how that may work here on today's episode of the show. Sayre, I think when we go through our biggest questions at cornerback, we've kind of asked some of them in terms of who's going to win the starting nickel job between Jahdae Barron, Ja'Quan McMillian, things like that. I think really the biggest question at this position here is, with all of these guys here, the solidified 4 guaranteed spots that we estimate are going to be there, how will the Broncos deploy their cornerbacks this upcoming season? And what I mean by that is, how will they use him, especially with the addition of Jahdae Barron in round number 1? I think this is a big question that even Broncos Country, they're having this conversation with themselves as well in our comments. They're having this conversation as well on social media. This probably is the biggest question right now at this position.
Right, because how they deploy their corners, it starts with the discussion of where's Pat Surtain? Where is he going to be against a team like the Raiders when you go up against Brock Bowers? And you're not just going to always be able to say, well, whoever just happens to be lining up against Brock Bowers is going to be the guy that covers him all game. No, you want your best on best, right? You want to make sure that Pat Surtain is shutting that part of their offense down. And the same goes for, I guess, other situations that they would face that are similar against the Chiefs. Is he going to be following around Rashee Rice? Is it going to be the same with Ladd McConkey in the Chargers? I mean, is Pat Surtain going to constantly shadow the number 1, or do the Broncos feel so confident in every guy that they now have at corner that they feel like, shoot, wherever these guys line up doesn't matter because we've got somebody that can match up? If they want to put Bowers on the outside over on Riley Moss's side, great. He can hang with him. If they want to put him in the slot, Jahdae Barron, he's got it covered. Same with Pat Surtain on the other side. So I think that's going to be interesting to start with, is do they slot Pat Surtain on certain guys throughout the course of a game? And we saw how many times did fans call for that last year, Cody? I mean, there was a number of instances, the Jerry Jeudy one in particular, to where it was like, why not just let Pat cover Jerry? And it's not always as easy as that, but certainly in that game, I mean, they probably should have figured it out at least one or two more times.
Yeah, it's because I think they're afraid of, say, are we going to put a rookie in and see if he can cover the other guys that were in that game? I think so much of it is going to be matchup contingent at this point, where I do think, Sayre, I think if there is a team that has maybe one really good wide receiver or a true wide receiver one, I think we'll see Pat Surtain travel to that guy, whoever it may be. Now let's go to a situation like the Broncos playing the Cincinnati Bengals, which is obviously going to happen Monday Night Football week 4 of this upcoming season. How is that going to work here for the Broncos? I imagine PS2 versus Ja'Marr Chase at this point is going to be what we see. There may be times where they move him to T. Higgins side. It could be situation as well. Like maybe 1st and 10, second down, it's PS2 versus Ja'Marr Chase, but third down, okay, it's PS2 versus T. Higgins, right? Or I think it could be somewhere along the lines of where the Broncos can look at a situation saying, okay, the Broncos, we're going to put PS2 on the number one guy no matter what. But where we put Riley Moss or Ja'Quan McMillian, Jahdae Barron, maybe it's trait-based matchups, right? Last season, Riley Moss covered a lot of the faster guys that Denver played, right? Trey Tucker of the Las Vegas Raiders. We saw Riley match up with him. The Broncos believe that Riley is their fastest corner on the roster. Pat Surtain, I think, is the most well-rounded. And Pat's got really good speed. We saw him hit, 21 miles an hour on his pick six against the Raiders early on in the season. But for Riley, I think they view him as the guy that has the speed to cover some of the faster guys that opposing teams have there. So maybe you match up speed on speed, Riley Moss versus whoever has the most speed on that roster. And then maybe there's a size thing. Maybe you have a smaller slot, or maybe it is, hey, Jahdae Barron, Ja'Quan McMillian against Ladd McConkey, and you're not moving it when you face the Kansas City Chiefs. Denver's got the option with these 4 guys, if they're healthy, to say, hey, this is what we're going to do. This is our game plan. We're going to move this guy here, or we're just going to play straight up. I mean, that's also another option the Broncos have on the table, but I very much think that this is going to be a move-around defense. That's something that when Jahdae Barron was drafted, Sean Payton told us directly after the draft, we can travel guys now a lot more. So that could be what the Broncos ultimately decide to do.
Here's a question for you. Do you expect the Broncos to be very heavily relying on man coverage again this year? I mean, obviously there's times that call for combo coverages or times where you want to play zone against teams, things like that. But with this team's pass rush ability, do you feel like that lends itself to Vance Joseph kind of having an easy button out there and saying we can play man coverage against anybody and feel confident about it and not feel like we're going to constantly be making mistakes? Do you feel like that's going to be something to watch for the Broncos this year? Or what are your thoughts on man versus zone, or how are they going to attack in terms of the coverage looks they give teams?
I mean, look at what happened last year when, with Riley on the field. 40% of the time that Riley was on the field, Broncos were in man coverage on those snaps. 32% when he was off the field. And so now you add in a guy like Jahdae Barron, who can play man at an effective rate, can play zone really well. Part of me thinks that we're going to see a lot more hybrid coverages this upcoming season, right? Where on one side of the field, you might get zone coverage, and then on the other side of the field, you may get man. It just depends on the formation, the number of threats that you have out there. I mean, the Broncos did some of that last season, but I still think that this is going to be a predominantly man coverage team. And I think with the guys that they've brought in, I think the blitz and the pressure factor that we have seen, I think that's going to increase here from Vance Joseph. And now I think that they have 4 guys that they're truly confident in saying, hey, we can blitz. We got 4 cover corners that can play man. We got a safety in Brandon Jones that we feel like can play man at an effective rate as well. And then you got a wild card in Talanoa Hufanga, who might just be one of those blitz pieces off the edge or inside that's going to give you an advantage of maybe getting some more takeaways if you can force a quarterback to throw it into tight windows and you could go make a play on a football with sticky coverage guys. I mean, that's where I think the Broncos' defensive game plan is ultimately going to lie here. And look, Broncos Country, as we wrap up our position preview on the cornerback room here for Denver, this is one that we're the most excited about because it is so deep here. And we talked about the position battles between Ja'Quan McMillian, Jahdae Barron. Make sure you let us know how you think that's going to go here as you're watching or listening to Locked On Broncos, wherever you get your podcast. But with that said, Broncos Country, we appreciate you as always. For all you everydayers out there, here's what you can expect on tomorrow's episode shows. We continue our training camp preview here. We're going to focus on the running back position. And while there is an all-out battle royale at this position for Sean Payton and his roster going to camp, we'll break that down on tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos.